Good day, everyone. This is Keith Ferry from Enterprise. Glad to be here with you all on the Advancing Racial Equity webinar for Section 4. This is a really great opportunity for us to sort of learn together as we're kind of leading and working on this issue of great importance to us and to the field and to the communities in which we work and serve. As I said, we're kind of leading and learning together. Enterprise is along with you in that journey. We ourselves are going through a number of different things of points of reflection, learning, awareness, kind of normalizing, level setting, and actual application of racial equity in our work throughout many of our markets around the country, throughout many of our initiatives. A few leading lights for us on that are our own internal workings and looking at our own diversity, equity, and inclusion as an organization. And as well as setting up our own racial equity working group to help us improve our practice. And through today's work with you all, we are, as again, learning and leading from this experience to do more in the field with you to advance this important work. So for us, it weaves into all that we do, our capital, our programs, our policy work, and I'm grateful that so many people are on today for this webinar. I'm also grateful that we have our colleague and partner in this from the Center on Social Inclusion, Dwayne Marsh, who's going to lead us through what I hope will be a useful presentation for all of us and a useful sort of engaged discussion at some point to hear how you all are seeing this and how we can help you advance the work in this way. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dwayne.
Great. Thank you so much, Keith, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody who's taking the time on a Friday to talk about some of these issues that we think are going to be helpful in your work. Just in getting started, I want to share what we're going to be doing over the course of about an hour and 40 minutes. You just heard a welcome and some context on the work of Enterprise as it evolves. I'll open up with a short report on some information about what happened in this round of competition. Some of you know this is the first time that racial equity was directly referenced in the Section 4 program. We'll then pivot to a presentation that frames up some of the definitions and tools that we think are out there to help you as you move into this work. Following that, we'll have a short commentary from my colleague Marissa, who actually will share a bit about the implications of this framing for the Section 4 program. We'll talk briefly about how to get started, and then we have a guest, Jim Steck from City First, who is one of the CB19 awardees who has been doing this work, and he'll just share some of his experiences in thinking about racial equity as they've been doing their work. I will then open the floor for Q&A, which will take for 25 minutes or as long as we need based on the number of questions that we have out there. And I really want to think of that as a conversation or dialogue. You know, as Keith said, Enterprise is finding its way into this work, and so in some ways, these questions may be ones that we have to take back and digest to be able to give you answers as you think about getting started. And then we'll close out with a look ahead and a forecast on the next round of the process, which is going to the time frame for that whole competition. So with that, let me start by sharing a little bit about the research and analysis of what happened in this previous round. Part of any good approach to thinking about how to advance racial equity includes using data effectively, and so Enterprise wanted to model that and decided to take a look at its own competition in the last round to see what they learned from including the language in their LOI process. So the goals really were to find out what happened as a result of articulating racial equity principles in the CB19 round, both the LOI and final application rounds, to see how the language actually influenced submissions, and to look for opportunities to sharpen how they query the grantee community or the applicant community as we get into the next round of the process. There were a lot of lessons. I think first and foremost, it was clear because of the area of focus that vast majority of Section 4 applicants have the opportunity to have some influence or advance racial equity outcomes in their work. It was also clear that wasn't automatically identified, that connection between the work that they do and the potential that they had to influence racial equity outcomes. Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't do that in their work, but people didn't necessarily make that connection in the application. We found that providing clarifying language in the RFP questions did allow people the opportunity to articulate those intentions, but we also found that there's an opportunity to sharpen the inquiry of Enterprise without making the application form unduly burdensome. The enterprise recognizes they don't want introducing this notion into your thinking to add a new level of burden as the work goes forward. There we go. There were some criteria that we used in doing the analysis, and you can see here it really ranged from, based on what was said in the application, an applicant being unaware of race or racial equity in their work and making no significant mention, all the way to having a deep commitment that their proposal centered on a racial equity framework. And in between there, having some cognizance of the issue, having an interest in the issue, or having a priority on the issue. And this just gave us a way to take a look at the responses to see how they played out. As you can see, we did a sampling, a pretty significant sampling, about 20%, maybe a little over, of the submissions for CB19. And on average in the LOI, we found that we landed about 3.11, which is identifying a particular potential strategy to address racial equity. The full proposal score tended to be a little bit lower, but we did find that about 16% of the applicants sharpened their articulation of their racial equity strategies they use as they move from the LOI phase to the actual RFP. There were a number of implications we saw from this. One was that if we can call forward specific requests to detail racial equity analyses, it actually made it easier for applicants to comply given the format of the application and the 5-question format. Those who had the strongest racial equity ethos in their work demonstrated the most consistent ability to articulate that work in the application. Some folks actually had that information but didn't choose to highlight it in the LOI or full proposal rounds, which leads us to some food for thought about how to move forward. And then we recognize that we can continue to integrate racial equity into the Section 4 process with some sensitivity to the nature of the application process. Again, we don't want to change that process in order to incorporate this thinking or framing. We want to make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't have what we call the feed the funder phenomena, that people are answering the question just because it's there, but aren't really thinking through or actually leading that in the work they do. And so want to be sensitive to the way that people can tell their story accurately, recognizing this is a capacity building grant, and not feel compelled to, fluff the feathers around what they're doing on the issue, but be honest about how they're thinking about it. And then we know that there's some lessons that can be integrated in the next work plan. One of the other implications was that we should actually look at instructional webinars for staff and the Section 4 applicant community, and this is part of that conversation. So we're going to actually turn at this point to framing and give you a walkthrough. And I should say this framing is one that we have seen be effective in a number of kinds of institutions and organizations. It's a point of departure for the conversation. And this webinar is actually putting out there a way for you to think about how you start to bring this into your work as you are a current grantee. We recognize that there are some people on the call potentially who are thinking about the next round of application as well, so maybe this will be helpful for you as you're doing that also. By the way, we're going to close the poll in a couple minutes when we see that there's a challenge with question number 3. So let's see if we can fix that before we close the poll. So we might leave the poll open a little bit longer. So just quickly, who am I to be speaking on this issue and talking with enterprise as they think about this work? I work with the Center for Social Inclusion. We're a national organization based in New York, really with the mission of seeking out and trying to dismantle structural racial inequity where we spot it, be that in institutions and government in various settings. And so we use policy and research, capacity building, and strategic communications as a way to do that, recognizing that ultimately we have to have institutional change if we are going to be able to achieve an advance in racial equity. We know government is a key part of that, and so we also work in a government alliance on race and equity where jurisdictions have stepped forward committing to lead with race in their policies and programs. And as you can see, this is growing work. More than 30 states and 150 jurisdictions around the country we are working actively, including a membership network that now has more than 40 members. So that is the work that I do. We also work with other institutions and intermediaries, which is why we've been working with this enterprise community partners to think about these issues. So when we think about how to actually engage the issue of racial equity, what we find from best practice in all manner of arena, from intermediaries to community-based nonprofits to government institutions, is what we like to refer to in technical terms as buckets. Three main themes or focuses, the foci of work that will help you to achieve that. And we refer to this as normalize, operationalize, and organize. And normalize for us is building a shared definition of the analysis of the issue. We recognize that if we were to pass out virtual index cards to all 180 people who are on the call today and say define racial inequity or define racism, we'd probably get 175 answers. And those people could be referring to individual acts of bias, people could be referring to an institutional practice that actually marginalizes a particular community, they could be talking about structural forces at multiple institutions. All of those would be right, but if we don't actually align our conversation, we won't be able to have a strategic discussion on how we build solutions. And so that shared analysis is a key part of this work. We also know we have to hold an urgency and priority on this work. It's generational in nature. We know that it's going to take a lot of work over a long time to actually reverse some of the patterns we have, but we don't have the luxury of waiting a generation to make that happen. And so normalizing is about holding and building that urgency and priority. If we can do that, we know we then have to operationalize. We need to look at the tools that can actually help us to address concerns we're finding and how do we lift up data and find solutions and strategies. And that data needs to be able both to paint the picture of the issue as it stands. It also needs to be able to track our progress and tell us if the results that we're getting from the work that we're doing is having the benefit and impact that we want, or if we need to make adjustments. And then we have to organize, and that's more than just the traditional sense of community organizations organizing at institutions because of institutions that failed them. It's also institutions themselves thinking about the internal structures and processes they need to build and the partnership between community and community institutions and larger institutions to think about how we can co-design the kinds of communities that we want to create. All of that while holding the reality that communities will continue to organize against institutions that they feel have failed them, which we believe is essential in this work. So there's some values and realities that we just want to recognize that we hold up fundamental to the founding of our own country, right? That all men are created equal, founded in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson crafting that nearly 240 years ago, and crafting that in a room of colleagues of white men, and when he said all men are created equal, he meant white men landowners. And so just shows that our notion of equality has even shifted as our cultural values have shifted over time. The notion of liberty and justice for all, coming from the Pledge of Allegiance, read thousands of times in schools all across the country, and yet knowing that we haven't necessarily achieved that aspiration as a country. And then government for the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Coming from the seminal speech given by Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, which I think today continues to be an aspiration for most local and state and federal government entities, and yet we know there's still some work to be done. That aspiration holds us to what our nation's values are supposed to be around equity and equality. Our reality, a little bit different when we look at the history of institutions and race. We know that government, for instance, actually explicitly created and maintained racial inequity for at least the first 200 years of our existence, and some would say even longer. And so we know that we had work to do to reverse those explicit patterns of being racial inequity being maintained. We know that wherever there is an inequity, there are people fighting for equity. That has been historically always true. And in the U.S., it's no different. And that work really culminated in the middle of the last century with the work in the Civil Rights Act. We saw many forms of discrimination outlawed. We saw it become illegal in many ways. But what also we saw was that the conversation on race went silent, that it became almost taboo to discuss race, and that we thought we might achieve race-neutral policies and end racial segregation and inequity by not having those conversations. When in fact what we learned was that by not discussing the issues, often many of the systems and institutions which had had a couple of centuries to build and perpetuate inequity could not really be reversed without that discussion. And so quietly some of those systems still continue to maintain inequity. What we've seen most recently is government joining the conversation of community-based institutions and advocates to hold up proactive policies, practices, and procedures that can advance racial equity. And so we're in a moment where the synergies are strong for us to be able to have a different story told about the work that we do in communities. Just in context in this moment, which is a hugely historic political moment in many ways, we see at multiple scales why racial equity is important. Here you can see just some examples of, at a local level, why this is important. In Seattle, it's been demonstrated that if the African-American unemployment rate were just to be reduced to the level of white unemployment, you can generate more than $25 million annually in tax revenue. So economic issues and opportunities that are lost because of racial inequities. The Twin Cities, recognizing that as it diversifies, if they don't eliminate the racial inequities in workforce training and education, they'll have a 30% skill gap. There literally will be 30% of the jobs they have in the region that they won't be able to fill. And in New York City, where more than $19 billion are given out annually in contracting, only 3% of those dollars go to women and minority-owned businesses. If that contracting were proportional to the population base of the city, you'd see another $8 billion annually going to small enterprises led by people of color and women enterprises. So this is the dollars and cents argument and reality beyond just the moral value in doing this work. There's been extensive research done. Manuel Pastor, for more than 15 years, has pointed out that the more income inequality we have in regions, the more likely those regions are to be susceptible to downturns in the economy, economic shocks, and the longer it takes for them to recover. So again, it's in the interest of regions to think about these issues. And we also know that as a nation, that we are losing resources and value from the work that we do. PolicyLink in their National Equity Atlas has estimated more than $2 trillion of lost GDP just because of the racial equity gap. So this really is, as they say, the superior growth model that we need to think about as we do our work. This probably comes as no surprise to most of you on the call. The question is, how does that then connect into our work? One last thing we'll say is that we know that this moment we have a crisis in housing and homelessness and gentrification that's sweeping many of our larger metropolitan cities, that our living wages are not sufficient, that in fact the conversation on issues around police violence and communities of color has lifted up this discussion on race in a way that we hadn't seen in decades, not because that violence has increased, but because the technology to track the reality has caught up to it. And then we know that the debate about whether we have a post-racial community or nation has effectively been annihilated, that we in fact are not in a post-racial society. And so all of these things are at play as you do your work on the ground, trying to move the programs and policies that you interact with. So no flash, newsflash here, racial inequity is pervasive in the United States. It's widespread, literally from life to death. And from mortality rates to life expectancy, race will predict how well you do across any number of issues in jobs, in housing, criminal justice system, the environment, and equitable development. That, in fact, is what draws many of those of you who are on the call to this work. So as we think about this, we want to turn to that first bucket I mentioned earlier of normalizing the conversation. One of the things we talk about often is equity versus equality, and you'll hear these terms bandied around. And what we want to hold up here is that equity really tries to understand the lived experience of populations and people as we try to get to the end game of all of us being able to fully participate and prosper in the economy. Equality tends to focus on making sure everyone gets the same things in order to have that achievement. So like equity, equality aims to promote fairness and justice, but it doesn't recognize the reality of conditions and context, including where people have started, what historical barriers they faced into being able to participate in the economy, and what people's needs are that may be different and distinct. And so we are looking, as we try to think about equity, at trying to build an approach that can actually incorporate all of those things. Now, we as an organization lead with race for a number of reasons. And so we talk not just about equity, but racial equity. And those reasons are really multiple. One of which is that we know that racial inequities are deep and pervasive. That, in fact, when we look at other kinds of marginalization, which we wholly endorse trying to address, we find that there are racial inequities within those areas of marginalization, heterosexism, ableism, sexism. Those are all critical issues to address, but even within those different marginalizations, we still see deeper racial inequities. We know that in this moment that racial anxiety is on the rise, that often it's the conversation no one wants to have, and that racial inequities flourish in those kinds of conditions, that we have to be able to address those. We know that when we lead with race as an institutional and structural approach, we learn lessons that can be applied to other forms of marginalization. And so We think this is a good way to build momentum to deal with those things. And then we know that despite that, specificity matters. We can't just say we want equity for everyone, forever, and think that we're going to get the kinds of outcomes we want by race, by class, by gender, or other kinds of marginalization. We have to have specificity in this approach, and so we use racial equity as the lens by which we can get there. 3 things to think about as we do this work. Race is a construct. It's not biologically determined, and it's a modern idea. It's been scientifically demonstrated that we are one race, the human race, that our physical appearances are not actually racial constructs, and yet we have built our own notions of race on appearance, and then have built policies to reinforce those, and then have built inequities into those policies that have created differential outcomes for people who have been classified in this artificial way. We know that policy drives the social construction of race and has contributed to changing ideas and definitions of race over time. The first half of the 20th century is littered with court cases, policy decisions that essentially defined our races and then defined access to opportunity that had racial bias or drive in that work. We also know that most of us, the oldest of us, most experienced, remember, in fact, some of those things, but we didn't choose this system. But as workers in community development, community improvement, all the things that you do in the Section 4 grant program, we do have a responsibility to address it, and that leads us to the work that we're talking about today. So it's important to have a definition to hold, and we hold as CSI that closing the gaps so race does not predict one's outcomes of success, while also improving outcomes for all. It's important to note that we think you have to start and focus with those who are most marginalized and those who face systemic discrimination. But we find that if we do that, we tend to actually improve outcomes for all people. And so that is an essential part of advancing racial equity as we see it. We also know that we have to look not just at services, but also changing policies, institutions, and structures. And our experience is that the service work we do is hugely essential, but that if we don't change systems and structures and get the transformational approaches to doing this work, we won't be able to have lasting impact and be able to move through to outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So this is just language that was in the last LOI, which for CB19, and it shows 2 definitions. The definition I just shared with you, which you can actually check the link for more detail on, and it also shows the definition around equity. And just to say that it shows the commitment that enterprise has as it's moving forward to think about these issues in a sensitive way and reflect that in the Section 4 program. So I'm thinking at this point we might close the poll just so we can share the results later. So Donna, if you're able to do that, and then we'll let the information tally up, and we'll come back to this in just a little bit as soon as I figure out how to interpret this data. Oh, I see how to interpret it. Good. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Just want to say a bit about an important dimension on racial equity, and that is that there's institutional and system and structural issues we have to think about, but it also is a human dimension. And you'll see here the fact that human beings, how we process information, how we actually interpret data, is pretty important to this notion of advancing racial equity. Human beings actually need meaning. They need collective meaning and individual meaning. So we process that information on our own. We also, in our engagement with social settings, do that work. So if you hold that notion, then you hold the notion that most of our emotional cognition is subconscious, that in fact, when we're going through our day-to-day routine, 2% roughly is an active, on-surface processing of our emotions, but the rest is flowing subconsciously. And racial bias tends to reside in the unconscious network. The result is that we unconsciously are thinking about race even when we're not explicitly discussing it. It's also important to note that bias can result as a consequence. Now, bias is on its own not necessarily bad. It's just the evaluation of a group and its members relative to another. We all have bias. In fact, it's been demonstrated. And if we were to poll and I said, how many of you have bias? If anybody said no, we'd have to beg to differ because it's been demonstrated we all hold biases. The challenge is that when we act on those in a discriminatory way, we can create negative outcomes for particular groups. And so why is this important to hold as we think about this starts to play out? Because there are two kinds of bias that we have to look out for in the work that we do. And explicit bias is just that. It's expressed directly. It's explicit. People who are operating with an explicit bias are aware of it, and they choose to do that. You know, an example would be signs in an apartment window saying whites only. Well, we don't see that because it's wrong, but also because it's now illegal to the progress that was made during the civil rights movement. But implicit bias can have almost the same effect, and it's expressed indirectly. It operates at the subconscious level. People may be unaware that they're actually doing that. An example would be that if a property manager were to do disproportionate criminal background checks on African-American applicants versus whites, that could have the same impact of, you know, having discriminatory impact on African-Americans, even though there wasn't a sign on the window saying whites only. And one example we can point to this, it's worth a mild diversion or side story, if you will. In the city of Seattle, they did testing, as many cities do, around, you know, housing testing, and they found, in fact, and for those, I think everyone's familiar with this, but essentially two testers go in. One is white, one is a community of color, a person of color. Everything is equal: credit scores, history, education, application, vendor letter, only difference being race. And they found when they did a round of testing several years ago, a 69% differential treatment for the applicants of color. And that could be anything from not showing the same rooms or claiming the same number of rooms were available to an applicant of color versus a white applicant. It could be holding back on describing amenities. It even could be a difference in the price quoted in the rooms, ranging to hundreds of dollars, and which seems hard to fathom, but in fact would happen. And so when this was uncovered, the city had to figure out what to do. They actually wanted to, when appropriate, take legal action, but it's very difficult to build a legal case, and you have to have triple testing. There's a lot of things they could do to get there, and so they would do that when it was appropriate. They would pursue those routes and go forward. But that left a large segment of the people who were demonstrating some bias in their application process not touched. So their decision was, let's bring those landlords in and talk with them. And as you can imagine, when they would do that, the reaction from most of those landlords was disbelief. I don't know what you're talking about. That is not me. Are you claiming I'm racist? You know, we have fair housing closer in the window. We actually love a diverse set of clients in our units. And then they would share the data and would show, in fact, that there was a disparate treatment. And so that would be an awakening moment for many of these landlords. Now, you could stop there and hope for a change in behavior, but that wouldn't really be a systemic approach to addressing the issues. So they built a code of conduct, a checklist, if you will, for how landlords should engage when they get any query, regardless of who it's from, to think about how to go through that process. In Seattle, it turned out 90+% of landlords were part of a realtors association, and so that association codified that checklist. Now, did that checklist and that process actually eliminate bias in the housing industry in Seattle? Of course not. But it did put some systemic structures in place that could allow the city to try to improve the situation going forward. So a couple of examples of implicit bias and how they play out. For many of you on the call, and when we talk in groups live, we always like to ask the question, how many of you have been to the symphony lately? And never enough people raise their hand because it's like classical music. But if you have, you've noticed that there has been a dramatic shift in the number of women in symphonies, up from just 5% of professional symphony orchestras in the 1970s to almost 25% today. Now, that's not nearly enough, but it is a pretty significant growth rate. We don't think that women discovered classical music in the 70s, and as a consequence, that number has grown. What we recognize is that most symphony orchestras recognized their lack of diversity was costing them audienceship, that they needed to deal with that. And so they started proactively going at that work. As it happens, sociologists love to track trends that are going to take a long time to check out, and so they followed this process. And a number of studies showed, in fact, close to 50% of the increase in females in symphony came from what they call blind auditions. This would simply be a screen being up, and the performer would step on the stage, the reviewers would hear that performer without seeing them and make their choices there. And that was a big part of the growth that we saw. Some places took an additional step of a double-blind screening. And by double-blind, I mean instead of the performer coming on the stage, the people reviewing would come on the stage or come on behind the screen. and that actually led to a 10% increase. Now you might ask, why would that make a difference, the double-blind audition? The reason was footfalls. Even hearing the stage, the heels walking across the stage could trigger implicit bias for the reviewers. And this is in a situation where the goal was to increase the number of women in symphony. So when we say implicit bias cuts deep, there's no joke in that. It's really a deeply held thing that we have to address. Not surprising, I think many of you have seen studies of this nature, that you can have everything be identical in job search, identical resumes, educational background, activities. Just change the name and have a different result. White-sounding names having 50% more callbacks than African-American sounding names, whatever that might mean. And in this case, in this particular study, it was meaning that while a white applicant for a job would drop 10 resumes to get a callback, it took 15 for the African-American sounding name to get a callback as well. And so a lot of government jurisdictions wrestle with how they deal with bias in their application process, even as they have tremendous workforce pipelines that they have to address. So what do we do with this reality that bias exists and that we all hold it? One of the things that we know is that holding on to bias, denying that we have it, trying to think we can resist it, may actually increase prejudice rather than eradicate it. And so we have to instead openly acknowledge that bias exists and have it as a way to challenge us to develop strategic interventions that can address those realities. In the end, for us, racial equity is both process and outcome, but we have to have the outcomes that we want to see created, and we want to see how do we create those outcomes. Before I dive into that, though, Melissa has been here, and she's been handling the Q&A. There have been some logistical questions that have come up so far, and we're seeing some more questions, but I wanted to take a moment and just share with you what the polling revealed about who's on the call. So 81% of you are nonprofit organizations. We have 5% of you being for-profit and 3% other. In terms of the question of experience dealing with these issues, 4% of you said no experience in taking on racial equity in the work that you do. 21% of you said you have some experience in this. 30% said that we actually try to, what that one says, the third option there, 30% is kind of that midpoint. 12% have specific programs or strategies to try to take this on, and then the 12% of you said that it's central to your work. Our work centers on racial equity. So a pretty diverse spread, but about 25% of you new to this work in some way or working on it, and 75% of you having some or considerable or deep central experience. So we thank you for joining into the conversation, from that broad range. And this is helpful information for enterprise also as they continue their own exploration. So I'm going to see real quickly if we have any questions that we should answer right now. And I think it looks like we're all good. There have been some logistical questions and a couple of program questions, but nothing that we need to address at the moment, so we will continue. So about outcomes. Now we've talked a bit about the notion that there are explicit and implicit forms of bias that we have to take on. And we've talked about the fact that individuals can hold these biases. We've talked about the fact that institutions can actually hold them as well. It kind of creates a natural grid, if you will, of vigilance for how we think about this in our work. Institutional explicit bias that we have to take an eye out for. Institutional implicit bias, individual explicit and individual implicit. If we were to press hard on this matrix, or this kind of quadrant of vigilance, it flattens out pretty nicely into thinking about ways to take that on. So I'm going to share for a few minutes an example that comes from police. And not to pick on police, but we like this example because police created this example. And for context, know that this was also in the city of Seattle as a result of a consent decree. Police were going through a process to look at implicit bias. To think about the implications of that for their work. And they did this exercise as part of that. And the conversation they had was really illuminating. And so we start with institutional explicit. this notion that policies that explicitly discriminate against a group. And in their context, what they tried to think about, as an example, was police departments refusing to hire people of color. And no one could come up with an example because, of course, it's illegal. And if someone were to try to do that, they would be sued. And so, again, the progress we've made in the civil rights movement has created some bulkheads and columns we can build on for racial equity. But there were some reflections that, you can have a similar effect without necessarily being explicit. And so one example we point to is when Ferguson happened, we know that there was the kind of pivotal moment when the chief of police got on national news and was being interviewed and was asked, do you have officers of color on your force? And the answer was, we have an African-American and a Latino. There were 3 people of color on the force, so about 130-plus officers in a city that was 50% African-American. And so while it was no explicit institutional policy against that, the net effect of the institutional implicit, which we'll get to, had put them in a similar situation of a workforce that wasn't necessarily able to be engaging with the community in a similar way. So there were consequences of not being able to achieve racial equity in that workforce. So as the group went on to talk about other kinds of bias, they went to institutional implicit. And we'll say that here is where a lot of the work for institutions, particularly larger institutions and intermediaries and government institutions, sits, because implicit bias can be undetected. It can actually permeate through multiple divisions. It can foster and grow, uninhibited for many years and can be widespread and difficult to combat. And so this is where a lot of the work often focuses. In your smaller organizations, you may have this dynamic as well, but may be easier to address. And so here is where you have policies that negatively impact a group unintentionally, but can still have that negative impact. And the conversation for police was fascinating. They talked about focusing on street-level drug arrest. And in this context, they were, recognizing that the criminal justice system is hugely disproportionately of color, and that they know that process starts when the arrest is made, when the call is made. And they said, okay, so we know that there's disproportionality from the moment of arrest into how the court process happens to the sentencing to the conviction rate, all down the pipeline, perpetuating, exacerbating this inequity. But what do? Are we not supposed to take on people who are doing drugs in the streets? And why is that disproportionately impacting people of color? So as it turns out, statistically, whites do drugs at a slightly higher rate than people of color. They also deal drugs at a slightly higher rate than people of color. But the way in which those drugs are dealt is different. And often, and not always, obviously, that happens in social settings, in private settings. Pharmaceuticals is more prevalent among white communities and other communities, college campuses. And so the conversation turned to the reality that in some ways the nature of patrol and the easiest way to make a street level arrest with that street level, that began a chain of events that led to disproportionality in the criminal justice system around drugs. Didn't mean that they were going to stop policing in that way or decriminalizing drug use, but it opened a conversation to think about a different way of coming at the issue to deal with some of those institutional implicit biases. We turn to individual level. In explicit, a police officer calling someone an ethics slur while arresting them. That was, in fact, what happened that led to this consent decree. And again, this was something that was intolerable, that people recognized had to be stopped, and that there had to be personal level training to deal with those kinds of things and ways to screen that out. But the implicit individual was a police officer calling for more backup when stopping a person of color. And as it turned out, that happens not just for white officers, but also officers of color. And again, another fascinating conversation that results, how do we deal with these kinds of biases when we are trying to do our work? Now, this is what happened for the police in Seattle when they had their conversation. But this exercise, for those of you who are in that 25% just beginning to think about these issues, can actually be a helpful one for you as you think about how bias plays into the work that you do. And so when we share the resources, you'll see this deck, you'll see this slide, and I'd invite you to try this out as an exercise with your teams to see if there's anything that reveals for you as an organization, even as you're doing the good work that you do. And so often when we work live with groups, we'll actually unpack this for 45 minutes to an hour with teams to think about those issues. So there's just an exercise that concretely you can think about to take on as you're doing this work and having your own discernment as Enterprise has it. So again, just closing out with some on the definitional piece, what we mean when we say individual racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. Individual being a prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. Intolerable, unacceptable, we have to deal with it, we have to take that on. But we recognize that institutional racism is a place where we have to be even more vigilant, that there can be policies, practices, or procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, and that may be unintentional or inadvertent, does not diminish the impact. And then structural racism is the reality in the history of current institutional racism across all institutions that combine to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. Because the reality is nobody walks out of the house and says, today I'm going to deal with the transportation system. We live holistic lives. We know that our structures are all connected, and in fact that if every institution or most institutions have a bias or are discriminatory in their impact on you, the cumulative impact is going to be oppressive. And that really leads us to the kinds of strategies we have to think about as we do our work, even if we work within one of these particular arenas. So with that, I'm going to pivot from definitions and framing and talk a bit about a tool approach that we think can be useful in doing this work, and that fits under our classic bucket of operationalizing the conversation. We know that race plays out in institutional policies. In fact, the work of the Federal Housing Administration in the 30s, through redlining and the GI Bill, other practices really led to the land use patterns and the lending patterns that we deal with today, helped to form the suburban landscape and created huge disparities in wealth and opportunity. HUD now just recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. Most of that existence has been spent trying to undo some of the realities that were created by the work of the Federal Housing Administration, even as many of their policies were intended to have positive impact. Some would argue not all, but the reality is that the impact was the same. When we look at environmental justice impacts, and this is just DC trash transfer stations, on the map you'll see in yellow, very small dots there, those trash transfer stations, and you'll see in the dark green that that population is entirely where those facilities are. I don't even have to read the key for you to know that those are going to be high proportion communities of color, in this case African American. And the fact that the key is not necessary for this map says everything we need to know about structural racial inequity in the United States today. But we do know that we have a better alternative in front of us. And then the interstate highway system. And I often will share that a couple years ago I was in Italy heading towards Siena and driving on their superhighways, and the sign said 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers to Siena. And I was quite excited. I was actually with my wife. I said she'd never been to Italy. It was my favorite city. I was going to show it to her. And then 5 kilometers later, we were on a side road somewhere. And then I was semi-lost. And then we were trying to find our way in turns and contorted ways to get into town. And if it weren't so beautiful in Tuscany, I'd have been frustrated. But then it hit me. That was because they made a conscious choice when they built their superhighway system not to destroy communities, that they weren't going to eviscerate downtowns or urban cores of central cities in the process of having the interstate highways connect those major places. And I was just profoundly struck by what a different nation we'd have today if we had had that one criteria as we started building our interstate highway system. And so as we think about these different systems, it's profound the difference that a choice can make to help us to have better outcomes for all people. My wife will be mad at me for mentioning the national webinar, but what can I say? So one of the tools that we see is really critical is a racial equity tool. And this is acknowledging that to get to better outcomes, it's both process and product, because both the process and the product of dealing with creating racial inequities over centuries and decades has been critical, and we're going to have to do the same thing to reverse that. We see this as a strategic planning tool, and the key is that you actively insert racial equity into the decision-making process. Now, for those of you in the 42% online who are deeply vested in this work, this may not be new to you. And you, in fact, should say, well, I saw a racial equity tool I liked even better than this one. That's cool. There are multiple tools out there now. Our sister organization, Race Forward, has a tool. There are foundations now that have racial equity tools. And the fact that the proliferation of these tools speaks to how important it is to have this conversation or frame as you think about your work. So I'm going to take about 15 to 20 minutes and walk through how we think you can apply this tool. It starts with understanding that there is an arc in this work that is both iterative and circular in some ways. And so this slide poorly represents what we think is the approach you want to do, but it has the steps that you need to think about somewhat sequentially as you go through the process. And it starts by looking at the desired results. What is it you're actually trying to achieve from a racial equity perspective? It moves to an analysis of data, thinking about what information you need in order to define your problem more effectively and maybe redefine your problem based on the data points that you are able to pull and discover what data you don't have. It moves to an active and ongoing conversation with community, especially affected community, and how they do this work, which might take you back after a conversation or two to reshaping your desired results. It moves into building strategies that actually can advance racial equity with the sense that you really want to be cognizant of the outcomes and the implications and unintended consequences of the strategies you apply. And this recognition that often in community-based work, in institutional work, and government work, we spend a lot of time undoing some of the realities that are created that weren't anticipated when we do this work, and we think there's a body of lessons learned now that can be helpful in that. Having a clear implementation plan that, in fact, if you don't have a roadmap, then you will be in peril of getting where you're trying to get, and you will find that logistical problems can become political problems in the work you're trying to do. I'll share a story on that shortly. And then having communication and accountability. How will you be able to share how you're moving this work, hold people accountable as they go through the process? So these are the primary steps of going through that work. Who should use the tool? Institutions, government, elected officials, community. We find value in all of these entities using that work. Elected officials often will want to be out front. They want to lead. They don't want to be too far out front, though. They don't want to be on a branch that's too light to support their weight. A tool can provide them the information and resources they need to be bold and embolden them to do that work. Government staff, other institutions can use this as a way to evaluate their work. Community itself can use this as a way to communicate with other entities about what they're looking for. And so we find that the more people are applying tools, the more fast the conversation can be. And we often share this to the point of intentionality. One day Alice came to a fork in the road, saw a Cheshire cat in a tree. Which road do I take, she asked. Where do you want to go, was his response. I don't know, Alice answered. Then, said the cat, it doesn't matter. If we're not intentional about what outcomes we're trying to achieve, we may in fact exacerbate the inequities we're trying to address. And so we have to be very strategic in how we go through this work. So another thing I'd like to mention about this is that it involves choice points. Often, because of the enormity of the problem, we think we have to find a home run solution that's going to deliver a population or a community or a neighborhood into better outcomes. And that is important. But we find that key decision-making opportunities can come at all shapes and sizes, and that the cumulative impacts of many small choices often set the framework or the baseline to be significant as the impacts of big decisions. And that it's helpful to use a tool across all choice points because it reduces the likelihood that we'll replicate the status quo, particularly on practices that have taken us in inequitable directions. So this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually also instructive and important. You should use the tool early in the process. You should use it often in the process. You don't apply the tool one time and feel like you're good to go. You will revisit aspects of the tool as you do your work. And what's important to say is using the racial equity tool is a muscle, and you will determine how to build that muscle. And much like many exercise programs, at least that's what they tell me, you actually will find the program that works for you and allows you to build your strength and build and tailor a tool to the opportunities that are important for you. So as we think about this, now we've gone backwards just a moment. It can be used in a number of kinds of policy and program decisions, and we've seen it used criminal background checks and hiring to revisit why that's important or essential. To look at contracting policies and procedures, both for organizations and for institutions. Public utilities ranking their projects differently, which can have the implication of millions of dollars of investments. Complaint-based systems being reevaluated to figure out how, in fact, the work can be more effectively done. And so there's probably no limit to the number of ways in which you can apply the tool. So we're going to walk through an application, just kind of the steps of that process, and provide you some food for thought on each of the steps along the way. The first step What is your proposal, and what are the desired outcomes and results? We really want to be able to focus on impact here. We want to show the link between community conditions and performance accountability. How do we know that we're going to actually have impact on external world conditions? And we want to be able to focus clearly on the end result and condition we're trying to impact. We are now, CSI is shortly going to put out a tool on using results-based accountability for racial equity. So that will be another resource out there in the field available as you're trying to tell the story. And all of you are familiar with the struggle to document progress in your work because these are systemic and long-term change initiatives that we're engaged in. Doing that for racial equity can be particularly challenging. And so we have to be able to find how we can share outcomes at the jurisdiction, department, program, community level. And we want to really say, be able to share the quality. How well did we do in the thing that we're trying to do, the quantity, how much of the thing did we do, and ultimately, is anyone better off? At the end of the day, you want to be able to answer the following questions. Can you describe the program, the policy, the practice, or the budget decision that you're considering looking at? Can you clearly describe the intended results in the community and the outcomes that you will have as a result? And what does this proposal have an ability to impact? So this is all critical steps to think about as you are engaged in thinking about your proposed desired results and outcomes. Once you've been through that exercise, you may begin to think about community and performance data. What is the data telling us? A few things to consider here. Data has to be disaggregated by race if possible at all. We can't really track our progress on advancing racial equity if we don't have that information. And we need data at multiple levels, community level indicators and desired results, specific program indicators, and we need to be able to really figure out how data can help us to track our progress. Will the proposal have impacts on specific geographic areas, neighborhoods, areas, or regions? What are the racial demographics of those in the area? What does population level data tell us about existing racial inequities? What does it tell us about root causes or factors influencing racial inequities? And then what are the performance level data that we have to be available for our proposal? And that could be existing programs or proposed programs. And then importantly, are there data gaps? What additional data would be helpful in analyzing our proposed idea? Often we have access to certain kinds of data, or we know they exist. Experiential data, qualitative data is equally important in making these kinds of conversations, which in many ways leads us to the next step in the process, which is about community engagement. So in filling the data gaps, often we turn to community to help us with that, and that is looking at the affected communities, particularly communities of color. This is a place where it's important to think about the process for engagement, what kinds of time, space, and approaches we're using to do that, and knowing that data collection is not enough. We know that when we have small groups to feed into a larger process, we have to be transparent about how the recommendations will actually be played out in our processing of the information. Often we can have robust engagement processes and poor reporting processes. We don't get back to community to share what we've learned, and so we have to make sure we're not doing that. We also have to make sure if we're having larger engagements that there are different ways for people to share, so that if you're successful in outreach and you get 250 people to come to a conversation on an issue, we don't want 220 of them not to engage because they're intimidated by the size of the group or the structure of the meeting. We need to find ways that everyone can have voice in those conversations and be buoyed by the presence in large numbers and not kind of impeded by that. And so that means knowing your community, your population, and how to work with them most effectively to have that connection. We also know often that gatherings are not the way to go, that we have to use trusted allies and advocates, other kinds of outreach mechanisms that, again, allow us to have a transparent way of collecting and sharing information along as we go forward. The questions we want to be able to answer here are, who are the most affected community members who are connected with or have experience with the proposed action, and have we involved them effectively in development of the proposal? What has the engagement process told us about the burdens and benefits for those groups? What has your engagement told you about the factors that produce or perpetuate racial inequity, both for those groups in general, but related specifically to the proposal? These are all things that are critically important as we engage with community. And again, remembering, we might revisit this step as we go deeper into the process. Next, we need to talk about our strategies. And ultimately, this question of benefit and burden. How are we advancing racial equity or mitigating unintended consequences in doing this work? We're basing this on our data and our stakeholder engagement that pushes us towards certain strategies. Now, because we know that inequities are perpetuated through systems and structures, it's important to think about how complementary approaches will provide additional leverage. Most of us, as our own organization, can't individually change the system. We can have huge influence, but we're going to need partners and allies, sometimes within that system, to have the impact that we want. And so we have to think about how we do that. And we have to think about how we can expand our policies or for whatever we're working on to build broad partnerships that increase the likelihood of impact. Maybe if you could point to any number of examples in the work that you do. So in some ways this is common sense, but it's important to hold this step as you're thinking about the creation of your strategies. And remember that you want to be able to answer a few questions here as well. Given what you've learned from your data and stakeholder involvement, how will your proposal increase or decrease racial equity? Who's going to benefit or burden from the proposal? What are potential unintended consequences? And what are the ways in which your proposal could be modified to enhance positive impacts or reduce negative impacts? This is where your deep experience in the work that you do is a real asset. You've done work before. You've always looked back and thought, if we could have done this a little differently, maybe that would have helped us. And doing this work, as we think of racial equity, that database of your own experience becomes hugely important as we go forward. And then again, of course, complementary strategies and the ways that partnerships can strengthen to maximize impact in the community. How are we going to partner with stakeholders for long-term positive change? And this may be no nonsense, but it's worth repeating, are the impacts aligned with your community outcomes that you define in step one? Does this actually serve the outcome that you were trying to achieve with your work? You will spend a lot of time, as most of us do, in this arena of strategy development, but it's important not to rush the strategy. We think it's very essential to look at steps 1 through 3 to bring a sharper lens to the work you do in step 4. But then you have to implement. And the questions that we'd ask here are fairly straightforward. And you think about your plan, is it realistic? Often our plans are ambitious, bordering on realistic, but we have to think, is it realistic? Is it adequately funded? Is it resourced with the personnel it needs to move forward? Is it resourced the mechanisms we need to ensure a successful implementation and enforcement? And is it adequately resourced to ensure ongoing data collection, public reporting, and community engagement? Now, a quick story on this one. I was working with a jurisdiction just last year who were going to set a racial equity office. So the jurisdiction was expressing their commitment to these issues. As we went in, they asked us to talk to residents, to talk to members of the jurisdiction and the departments to see how to do this most effectively. And they were very nervous because they felt like there was a community vibe that was thinking they didn't care about equity. And in fact, when we talked to community, there was a lot of angst in the community about this issue. And they couldn't figure out why. And in fact, their council had put forward a proclamation saying, we want you to build a health equity tool, and then we want you to turn that into a racial equity tool. As we interviewed the jurisdictions, we found that, in fact, the community had, the jurisdiction had actually done that. The health department had worked with community groups, and the community groups recognized this in the interviews we did and said, the health department was great, but they never turned into a racial equity tool. The city manager's office doesn't care. They were just talking about it. And what we found out was there was a breakdown in the handoff of that tool from one office to another. It was a logistical issue. It had become a political issue because the narrative in the community had become they weren't serious, whereas the jurisdiction was. And so they've begun to mend that fence now at this point. But it just points out how important it is to have a very clear plan for implementation, timelines, responsibilities, measurements to be able to track progress. How do we know that we have a straight plan to do this? Which relates in a lot of ways to the final step, which is ensuring accountability, communicating, and delivering results. So if the answer to those previous questions I asked in implementation was no, any of them, you have to think about the resources you need to take action and what actions may be necessary. Here, we're looking at how to ensure accountability, communicate, and evaluate results. The data we use to design the strategy, can it actually help us to determine success? Can we develop mechanisms for collecting data that will help do that? Can accountability look at the processes and policies and leadership that needs to be in place so that we actually can lead to identification and elimination of the root causes of inequities that are actually implemented? This is huge because you're really getting at the core of the issue. And it's important to have communication, particularly with communities who have been affected and communities of color often have been affected, because In many cases, those communities have been through many rounds of this dance before. And so we have to really bring some value to that conversation if we're going to expect them to stick with us as we try to have impacts for racial equity. Questions you want to think about here? How will impacts be documented or evaluated? How will we achieve the anticipated outcomes we need? How will we have impact in the community? What's our messaging communication strategy to help us with community as we advance racial equity? And how will we continue to partner and deepen relationships with communities to make sure the work to advance racial equity is actually sustainable for the long haul? So that is a very rapid walkthrough of a tool that we think is important to apply, or a version of a tool. But if you don't have enough time to even do that level of this is the core question: who benefits, who's burdened by the decision? So I think at this point, I will confirm this. We're going to have just a few quick comments. We have the pleasure here to have Marissa with us from the who's leading up the Section 4 work for Enterprise, and she will say some of the early lessons from this work and implications for the Section 4 program. After this, we will actually turn to someone who's been in the program. We'll talk a bit about their experience as well. Marissa.
Good afternoon and good morning here from the West Coast. As many of you know who from the cohort of CV19 grantees, in the last Section 4 funding round, we introduced racial equity as a way to understand how organizations are actively addressing or planning to address racial equity. So in approaching this next round of funding this year, we learned that we needed to provide more resources and tools to assist organizations in how to address this issue in their work. So, having this webinar and giving you more information about how do you embed racial equity into your work, and then also changing the way or advancing the way that we ask about racial equity within the RFP process. We will continue to do in this CV20 round a two-step application process consisting of an LOI round and a request for proposals round. An applicant who passed the LOI round will receive a formal invitation from Enterprise to submit a full application to the RFP round. So there will be specific questions on racial equity in the LOI and RFP rounds. We want you to be honest and provide content on how racial equity fits or could fit in your work. Some examples of what you could respond with are to identify the current equity challenges to your current program, systems, and communities. Describe current or planned initiatives advancing racial equity. Describe proposed or ongoing changes to internal policies and processes. You may also include a desired short and long-term outcomes related to racial equity to help reviewers understand the aims of your efforts. As applicable, applicants can identify organizational capacity building needs around racial equity and how the grant will address those needs. You must respond to the racial equity question in this round to be assessed as addressing all criteria as listed in the LOI. The only thing we don't want for you, the only thing that we don't want is for you to be silent. If it is a place you need work, we want to help you understand and help get you there. So it's not enough to say that our population is the majority this, so we work in racial equity. We're looking for a clear description and plan for addressing systemic and structural inequities. So we have this webinar now. The LOI will be released on Monday, May 1st. And then we'll have another webinar for the LOI to answer general questions. But if you find that as you begin, you have questions about racial equity or applying the racial equity tool, you can ask those questions during the LOI webinar or email us at the RFP mailbox.
Great, thank you, Lisa. That was really helpful, and appreciate the work that Enterprise is continuing to do as we think about these issues. It's a unique opportunity to have a capacity building grant that creates the space for us to explore how we can strengthen our abilities in critical issues. So at this point, Donna, I think we want to activate the microphone for Jim Steck, who's the Senior Vice President for Affordable Housing at City First Homes. I'll mention that you can put your questions from the previous 45 minutes in the chat box now so that we can run through those after Jim's talk, and you can put questions for Jim as well in there as we go forward. But I will hand the talking stick back to Donna and potentially to Jim.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jim Steck, as Dwayne said, and I am the Housing Director for City First Homes based in Washington, D.C. City First Homes was created in 2010 as a workforce housing trust. And since then, we've created about over 240 permanently affordable homes. The original goal of our program was to provide a source of workforce housing to promote economic inclusiveness in the city and help prevent the hollowing out of the middle class due to the increased housing costs that we've seen accelerate over the last 10 years here. Our current focus involves partnering with the organizers of a new park called the 11th Street Bridge, which you see on the slide that's currently up there. This is scheduled to be completed in 2019. This is a really exciting project because it's going to create a park that will provide recreational, educational, and artistic space to be built on abandoned pilings, which you can kind of see there, that are existing now. The bridge is not, though. And it crosses the Anacostia River, which is what you see there in the foreground. This is an entirely homegrown DC project. Most of the parks and such in DC, as most know, are mostly national and federal. So this is entirely a DC project, part of what makes it exciting. And it links two very diverse neighborhoods, Ward 6 and Ward 8. On the slide that Dwayne had a while back that showed DC, I think it was the trash transfer stations, you could see the difference between the east and the west parts of the city, and this bridge is going to basically connect the two, and the river is a pretty strong demarcation point between the two portions of the city, the economically depressed, largely African-American community on the right side of the bridge, and then the more affluent, primarily white part of the community on the left part of the bridge, as you see there. So DC really is one of the most racially segregated cities in the U.S., and this east-west divide is really pervasive. The poverty rate on the eastern side is more than 3 times greater than on the western side. And then the affordability on the eastern side is much greater as well. 70% of the homes in the eastern section are affordable to very low renters, very low income renters, whereas only 7% can afford homes on the other side of the bridge in the western part of the city. The affordability is really challenging now. It's eroding as the city continues to gentrify. And our concern is that this bridge will further accelerate the gentrification process, putting pressure on the long-term residents and putting them at risk of displacement. So that's what we're really focused on with the Section 4 grant. Historically, we've dealt with the issues of racial equity from our founding. We were created by City First Enterprises, which founded City First Bank over 10 years ago. And it came from a bunch of organizers getting together in a church basement east of the river and talking about how to create a financial institution that would serve the needs of the folks that were largely ignored by the city's the larger financial institutions. So they came with this idea of creating a bank, and it's going to exclusively focus on the areas that were admitted, and in practice that has been the case. So City First Homes, which was created 10 years ago, as I mentioned, follows on this tradition. Going forward, what we're really looking for is, in the past, when the bank was created, the idea was the city really lacked economic investment. And there was large portions that were just really severely in decline. So it was bringing investment into the city was a big focus. And now that's largely been achieved through various reasons. And the issue now is really equitable development and making sure that the widespread economic growth benefits all portions of the city, and primarily the African-American portions, which have been left behind in a major way on the eastern side of the city. So this equitable development is something we're really working hard to promote. We sponsored a conference east of the river, which the Urban Institute presented, and they highlighted the differences between the two parts of the city and came up with some recommendations as to how some of these things could be addressed. I think everyone recognizes that some of these pervasive problems have many elements that capture both transportation, health, housing, et cetera, and a holistic approach is really necessary if we're really going to make lasting change. And one of the key ways we're looking at doing that is by creating a community land trust, an urban community land trust. It'll initially start on this eastern portion of the bridge, and the idea is to come up with a source of permanently affordable homes that can help prevent displacement, and that really will be run, organized, and managed largely by the community. So that's really what we're working on today in terms of helping create racial equity and trying to address, again, this gentrification and displacement pressures. The study there found that if some of these equities were raised in the city's economy in DC would actually be $65 billion larger. So this issue is obviously one of social justice, but there's also an economic growth component that would be very good for all residents of the city. So we're really focused on trying to do what we can do there. The study also showed that if there was racial equity in the district, there'd be an additional 5,400 homeowners in Ward 8. So this community land trust have deep roots in the civil rights movement and have a history of protecting residents from displacement, creating more resilient and vibrant communities. And so we're really looking to try to take this model that's been used largely in rural communities and adapt it to the needs of DC, which is obviously urban, and make it work for today. So that's really what we're doing and how we're applying Section 4 monies right now.
Thanks, Jim. I had a couple of questions for you. I think just one is, you said it yourself, gentrification is a pervasive and multifaceted issue. Can you say a little bit about the partnerships that you're identifying that will help you hold the line, hopefully, against what's obviously going to be a tremendous real estate impact when this pathway is created?
Sure. We're working with a group that's called Building Bridges Across the River, and they pre-existing before the Bridge Park came into view, and they created something called the ARC, which stands for Town, what is it now? It's for, now I can't think of it, but anyways, it's a multi-use facility east of the river that's a model for all sorts of communities. They have a children's hospital there, they have a ballet, they have all sorts of things, a charter school, and so they've been trying to provide this holistic approach towards empowering the community. And they stood up this effort that of this plan that's called Building Bridges Across the River to work with the community to develop an equitable development plan, trying to figure out how we can attack the problem from multiple fronts. And so they identified 3 key areas. One is this community land trust, and that's what we're primarily working on. The other is workforce development, and they have partners that are working with that in terms of providing training and jobs. And then the third is small business promotion. And we see there could be a role for the land trust in terms of promoting affordable rental space so that the mom and pop stores that have been longtime pillars of the community, as rents go up, they're not displaced as well. So there's a residential and a commercial aspect to the community land trust we're looking to help build with the residents.
Right, great. And my other question was just a question and an observation, but the question first. How are you, these processes can take weeks, months, years. How are you finding or able to stay authentically connected with residents, recognizing the constraints on them having to live their lives, even as these issues around them are having, huge impacts on how they live their lives?
That's a great question. Really, we've been working with, again, primarily with the groups that are based east of the river, and letting them kind of choose their own representatives largely. And so we're in the process right now of putting together an advisory group, and that'll be long-term residents of the city as well as other key stakeholders, so their voice will be not just heard, but actually decision-making in terms of how this trust gets built.
Excellent. So
did that answer your question, or did, excuse me?
It does. Stay with us. I think we may get other questions on the prompt here as we continue to wind down the webinar, but we will pivot on. One thing I just would mention, and what you're mentioning too, is that you started to pull up the economic value and pull to some hard numbers and costs, and we feel like that is an essential part of the equation of making the case for advancing racial equity. So we're glad to hear that you guys were looking at that as you get deeper into this process. So what we're going to do at this point is really open the floor for questions and answers. I think we've got a chat box that's available for people to put those forward. We'll have a few minutes for that, and if we get questions, we'll answer those. Again, as I mentioned, some might be direct answers that we can give just based on the presentation. Some might be questions that are going to be food for thought for Enterprise as they continue this process. So I would invite you to take advantage of this window to get those questions in, because now is the time to really help them think about how to keep moving forward. And then after we do our Q&A, we'll do a quick look ahead to the timeline for CB20, for those of you who are on the call who actually are looking to apply, or those of you who are 19 are looking to reapply, as the case may be. So cue your own imaginary Jeopardy music here while we see if we have questions coming from the participants.
And just a reminder that you can submit your questions by typing them into the Q&A box, which is located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. If it's closed, you can just click on the little arrow next to the word Q&A, and it will open right up. And make sure you address your questions to all panelists so we can all see them. While we're waiting for questions to come in, just a reminder that this session has been recorded. So in case you missed any part of it or simply want to revisit, a copy of the recording and of the slides will be made available to all participants. We generally say within 48 hours. Since today's a Friday, let's call it Monday. You can expect an email with the link to, again, both the slides and the recording.
So we have our first question, which I think we jumps a little bit ahead of what we're able to do here. It said list three specific approaches that will enhance approval rates for proposals. And I think all we can say at this point is that Enterprise learned a lot in the process last year, and so they're going to make sure the instructions for submission are clear, and their scoring also will be very parallel to the instruction questions. So I'd just say that really the one approach we could say right now is, just read the questions carefully and be thoughtful in your response. And the more thoughtful you are, the more the reviewers will be able to give good scoring as they do the analysis. There may be more that comes up in the LOI webinar about that we can discuss as well. We have another question here. One of my organization's primary service populations is lower income, older immigrants from Asian countries. We do not serve a lot of African American or Hispanic clients. How broadly are we defining race? We are looking for impacts across all racial groups. So if you have a community that's disproportionately impacted, it is not specifically about African Americans or Hispanics. It's about a population group that's been marginalized. And so, as you're doing your application, you want to be able to tell that story, even as you tell the story of just the importance of the marginalization of being low income, of being older, of being immigrant. There are multiple marginalizations at play here in your application. You just want to make sure that the analysis of how you're thinking about the racial impacts of what's happened to those communities is articulated. Or if you're struggling to do that, you want to articulate that you're struggling to do that and how you'd like to use the grant to help you do that. So that accounts for 3 of you. I know the other 178 of you might have some questions as well. And Donna, I've learned that you actually read the questions, so I will hold off on reading the next one.
That's quite all right. But again, we are playing the Jeopardy theme, just waiting with bated breath for your questions. So this is the time to make your fingers fly and send those questions in.
I see we just got a few too, which is great.
Let's see. Yes, my screen was not refreshing. Okay. Let's start with this one. It's a little bit longer. In our area, there's a strong pipeline for affordable housing. However, the median income is high. So our low-income communities are being gentrified by people who can access the affordable housing funds. Could there be a way of increasing housing for, and oh, I'm afraid it dropped off. Okay. Get back to us, Alan, and finish your question because it looks like a good one. Just we need the end of it. Let's try another one.
Before we do that, I will just say this. We're seeing this all over the country, particularly in metropolitan markets where median income is so high for the region that that even affordable housing units can be a gentrifying force. And I'll say this is edge work right now. That people are in San Francisco Bay Area, in Seattle and other regions are trying to figure out how we even get to deeper levels of affordability. And it's not just affecting communities of color, although it's affecting them disproportionately. It's affecting lower and moderate income white people as well. So this is an edge question that we have to find some new solutions for.
Excellent. And the end of his question is he was increasing housing for very low income. So moving on, the next question is there a specific geographical location or size that this grant would be suitable for?
When the LOI is released on Monday, you'll see that we have our markets in different geographic locations, and listed in a table for those are the geographic areas where they are located. So generally, the grants could be anywhere between $25,000 and $100,000.
So just stay tuned. Next week, you'll get some more clarity on the specifics of that.
Okay. Our next question is, we don't have a lot of diversity in our population. Not to say we don't have racial issues, but they are more cultural, e.g. homeless, LGBTQ, but also Hispanic. Minorities are overrepresented in our homeless populations and often disenfranchised, even though the population numbers are relatively small. Does that matter?
No, I think it's important to recognize that Enterprise is trying to have a racial equity analysis on this capacity building grant program. They're not remaking it the racial equity grant program. And so what they want to have is a clear sense of how your own analysis of racial inequity plays into your work. And just from the questions, and I'm sure we could have a long conversation about this, there are a lot of dimensions in what you're doing that are very nuanced. And so, you know, you can speak to that reality. I think that the message we're getting from Marissa and that we'll see in the LOI is, you know, be clear with us about where you stand on this issue so we can understand how we can be helpful.
And our next question, we think we're already addressing racial equity in our work and in our proposals. How do we know whether we need to beef up this narrative for new enterprise grant requirements?
So I'm going to say a little something first because I think Marissa's kind of held until the LOI comes out to be too specific. I think what we saw, and we did a little analysis from the CD19 round, that there were some groups who we suspect are doing some great work to advance racial equity who didn't talk about it or only talked about it lightly. So if you're doing strong work, share that story. You know, it's not about, you know, again, I said we want to avoid, you know, feeding the funder. It's not like we want you to say stuff about racial equity just because they're looking at this issue, but we want to understand where you're coming from on this. And if you have momentum in that, that's a positive thing to share. If you don't have momentum, don't be intimidated that because some others do, that you're going to be at a disadvantage in that way. Again, it's going to be a part of the analysis that's done, but this isn't a competition to figure out who the 10 groups are who are doing the best racial equity work and give them resources. This is still a capacity building opportunity that's trying to have a sharper racial equity analysis as it does its work.
Okay. Next question. Are anecdotes about our experiences working with members of the communities we serve helpful, or do you prefer just overall statistics about the impact of our work?
Helpful.
Helpful. The narrative that goes along with the LOI proposal is only 3 pages long. So if you could, I think anecdotes are very helpful, but if you could limit it to a brief description of that, you'll have more time or more room in the RFP if you make it to that round to describe it.
Okay. Next question. Under Section 3, I noted that there are some areas such as administration, clerical, et cetera jobs when applying. Is an applicant bound to involve their work to involve housing, or would career training services with a goal being to increase income to be able to purchase a home be enough to apply?
That one I am going to leave to Marissa just because it's more about the parameters of the application program.
Hold on.
Which we're doing a little screen toggling here.
I've lost it.
Actually, can you repeat that one down just so we can get it pulled up, because they're queuing in pretty fast now. So.
Yes,
I'm sorry,
not a problem.
I can jump in. This is Kate from Enterprise. So to David's question, I would say that because the LOI hasn't been released yet, we don't want to get into too many specifics yet. But if you want to send a question to our grants mailbox, it's rfp@enterprisecommunity.org. We can try and help you a little bit and answer your questions there.
Okay, great. So moving on to the next question, any hints on how to get local cities to identify and set aside areas for Section 4 housing? I liked mixed use.
So I think we should mention that there's going to be an LOI-specific webinar, and we're going to share the date in that in just a moment. So I would invite that question to be sent to rfp@enterprisecommunity.org, but also would encourage the sender of that to check out the LOI webinar, because in that session we'll do a short piece on racial equity, but most of it will be about the LOI itself. So if we can direct questions more specifically to this notion about racial equity, that would be useful for the window we have left for the Q&A right now. Also, the LOI will be out, so it'll be a little bit more able to answer those questions. You can't jump ahead of the release.
Okay. Let's see. Did City First build housing and apartments also? And how is Enterprise helping people of color receive funding in LA County and helping the new developers walk through the full process to be successful?
Is Jim still, audio still live?
He is.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the question was, does City First Homes build apartments? Is that correct? Today we've been focused on home ownership, but as we gear up towards creating this land trust east of the river, rental housing is definitely going to be a big component of that. And so part of the Section 4 funds is to help us explore the acquisition of properties that include rental. So that's a new area, but that's where we're headed towards.
And let me just ask on that, Jim, were you driven to that specifically because of the population and the reality of that population, or what brought you to that expansion of what you guys focus on?
Excellent point. Yeah, if you look at the if you're really trying to move the needle on changing outcomes, rental housing has to be part of the equation. And so we did start, it's really been kind of an evolution. We started first focusing on home ownership and workforce, and we've since moved to be more inclusive in terms of lower incomes that we work with. And so when you're dealing with lower incomes, obviously you move more towards rental and a little away from home ownership, although we seek to do both. So yes, we were led there by the population that we're seeking to serve.
Okay, excellent. I am scanning for questions now that are not LOI specific. This may be so, but we're going to give it a try. Is it possible for a Section 4 applicant/grantee to get information about our racial equity score on the CB19 application?
Marissa's nodding, but I'll let her articulate the way to do that.
So yes, if you want some feedback on the results of your application in the previous round, just email at RFP at our RFP box, and a grant specialist will respond to you.
Okay. And could you expand a little bit on how they can apply metrics in this area? Because systemic racism and inequality is hard to measure.
No doubt, and it's hard to measure progress on a lot of the work that we do, but particularly in these issues. Often where we start to focus is that step one, as you recall, of what is the proposed outcome you want to measure. So your work might be in housing, but as you're looking at a particular effort, you want to say, what is it that we are trying to achieve as a consequence of this initiative we're taking now? And if we were successful, what would that look like? And from that critical question of what would it look like, what would success look like, we back out the kinds of indicators and outcomes that we're looking for. So, if it's improved access to transportation that will get people to jobs, and that gives us a set of pathways we can look at. If it's, that people's commute time is reduced, if it's that educational opportunities are improved. We want to know, asking the why and what are we after question multiple times on step 1 is really critical, because it starts to identify both obvious and creative measures we can use to show, oh, we're making progress. And so the challenge with that is often those measures are difficult to get data for, or they're not disaggregated, or they are, no one's currently collecting, or that requires, we have some anecdotal experience, but it's not systematic. And so I'm really excited about, I think within the next couple of weeks, this RBA, this results-based accountability for racial equity tool that we're putting out, because it's going to plunge a bit into some of those challenges once you've been clear on what you're trying to achieve. So my two-part answer would be clear on the end goal of the strategy you're using to generate the data points, and keep an eye out for our RBA tool.
Okay, our next question is, can you expound a bit on equality of opportunities versus equality of outcome, and which this grant is trying to address?
I will expand in general and say that when the LOI comes out, they're going to have their language definition very clearly there. So I don't, we're in some ways we're talking about racial equity as it's been applied to CV19. I don't want to confuse that with CV20. There may not be many changes at all, but just so it's not confusing. For us, equality of opportunity or access is influenced by the systemic structures and pathways people have had to get to opportunity. So, but there's both process and outcome we have to look at. Have there been barriers to a population having full access to the opportunities that we're talking about? If there are, what are those barriers? How can we eliminate those barriers? If there was a consequence, what was the process by which those barriers were created? And therefore, how do we have to change the process for engagement or connection to access as well? So again, this notion that equal distribution of the opportunity alone will not work if people both don't have the pathways and have been historically blocked from those pathways. And so for us, a racial equity frame tries to troubleshoot or problem solve for those realities and bring people to a level playing field, and then being able to take advantage of that action or that opportunity.
Okay. Pretty much all the questions I am now seeing are specific to the LOI.
Well, I'll say that I don't think I'm getting ahead of school here. This is really helpful because when we schedule the LOI webinar, we can make sure these are being addressed. I'm presuming there'll also be some materials that'll be sent out from this, and some of these might be specifically answered in the materials that go out. And so don't feel like if your question is not getting answered right now, it's not going to be answered. It just might be answered in a couple of weeks in a more organized way.
And I'm not seeing any more racial equity specific questions coming in.
Well, there was just one that popped up just as you were saying that about keeping a group where they are, i.e. continue to build affordable housing in high poverty communities. Doesn't that just perpetuate racial inequality? The great debate of the modern age in terms of how we actually deal with concentrated poverty and access to opportunity. And I will say I'm not going to speak for Enterprise, so I'll just say that we see possibilities in a both-and approach that connects people to opportunities, across regions, and also in giving people opportunities to be in other places. But for us, this anti-displacement, anti-gentrification issue is about right to stay. And so it's very, often, we have these kind of policy conversations about this, but ultimately, when reinvestment's coming into communities, we want to make sure that people have the option to stay in a place if they choose to do that. And that, of course, is the point of departure for a 3-hour webinar that we're not going to hold right at the moment. We are going to pivot because the question came in about the upcoming session, so I think we'll take that as a cue to talk about what's coming next. Know that if you squeeze another question or two in there, it'll end up in the log, and we will deal with that in the follow-up for the conversation today. So let me thank everyone for a rich set of questions and talk about what's coming next, and look ahead. And really what we want to say is some specifics on the dates, and then maybe just a small kind of qualitative description of the energy that I think is here at Enterprise around continuing to do this work in a systematic way. So you'll see here, Marissa referenced the fact that the LOI is going to be released May 1st, which is next Monday. Keep an eye out, and I presume, in addition to the multiple ways that will be disseminated, that anybody who signed up for this webinar will get that. The application will be due on the 31st at 8 p.m. Eastern. And invitations to submit full RFP will go out July 10th, and then the applications will be due August 7th, again at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So you will be seeing more movement on this in the next few weeks. I guess I would just ask Marissa if there's anything she wants to say about just the tenor for the team. There's been a lot of energy working on this process.
So as I mentioned earlier, it'll be released on May 1st. So you'll see that on our website. And if you are hopefully already on our subscription list on the webpage right now, you can sign up to be notified of the upcoming funding opportunities. You'll receive an email with information and links to our website, as well as information on how to register for the webinar on May 10th, which will be at 2 o'clock Eastern time.
Great. I just want to thank everyone for joining the call, for bearing with us as we plunge through a ton of information really quickly, and encourage you to continue your discernment on these issues. I love the distribution of response in the poll in terms of both deeply experienced and newcomers to this work. Only by working together in that way are we going to have the impacts that we want. And we look forward to continuing to support you and Enterprise as you go forward in this endeavor. So, Donna, with that, I will hand you the talking stick to close us out.
Thanks very much. All I wanted to say was thank you, Dwayne and Jim, and also Marissa, for all of your points today. Thank you for our audience for joining us with this. We hope to see you again at the next live online event regarding the LOI. And with that, this ends today's webinar. You will be taken to a very brief survey form afterward. We'd love to get your feedback. It really is very helpful for us. So with that, this closes out today's session. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.